Welcome to this joint event hosted by ConservativeHome and UK with a Changing Europe. I'm Paul Goodman, editor of ConservativeHome, and I'm going to try and guide us through the next hour. Let me just set out how we're going to proceed. Just first of all, this is all Chatham House. Thank you very much. And what I'm going to do is introduce each of our four speakers in turn. They will speak for 5 minutes. I'm then going to ask a few questions and then go to the questions we've already had in. If you want to ask further ones, do try through the Q&A function, and I will do my best to call some. I'm normally and unusually, when we come to the questions, going to usually ask the Secretary of State to go first because most of the questions will be directed at her. Anyway, without any more ado, let me go to the first of our speakers, Liz Truss, Secretary of State of International Trade. Liz, over to you.
Well, thanks very much, Paul, and fantastic to be here this evening. First of all, I think global Britain is a massive opportunity for the UK. And in particular, in the week of the budget, we seek to recover the UK economy from the COVID crisis. There are huge opportunities to be found across Britain from engaging more in trade with the rest of the world and really driving an export-led recovery. We know that there are an increasing amount of jobs linked to trade. Increasing those jobs are linked to trade with the rest of the world. And we know those jobs pay more and they're also more productive and can help drive economic growth. And one of the points I wanted to make this evening is that a lot of the people who voted Conservative for the first time in the Blue Wall voted because they wanted to see industries revive in their local area. They wanted to see more success, more jobs. They wanted to see and be proud of goods that they sell overseas. And I think it's a key part of delivering for the Blue Wall is to actually deliver new free trade agreements, but also deliver the exports that go with the free trade agreements. And it's noticeable in some of the polling that we have done as a government that, in fact, trade policies are particularly popular in that part of the world. And of course, this harks back to the days of the abolition of the Corn Laws, when free trade liberated huge parts of this nation to be able to trade with the rest of the world. And what has happened as a result of being in the EU for a significant period of time is we have seen a lot of barriers to trade with the rest of the world. We've seen high tariff walls. We've seen bans on British produce, whether that's the beef ban or the lamb ban into Japan. And then our own independent trade policy gives us the opportunity to work to lift those bans, but also to reduce tariffs on key industries like ceramics, on the car industry, on robotics, all of which are significant industries outside London. And I also think we need to look at the shape of the global economy in 10 or 20 years' time. We know that by 2030, approximately 2/3 of middle-class consumers are going to live in Asia. There's going to be increasing demand there for British goods. So opening up more of those markets, reducing the tariffs into those markets is going to help drive jobs and growth across the UK. And what I think global Britain represents is it is a liberalising instinct. It is an instinct in favour of free trade, but it is also a ability to do things more flexibly, more nimbly, and have that freedom of manoeuvre. And we now have an opportunity to be a hub of trade in services, in digital, and also in advanced manufacturing. We've got a trade deal with the EU, but we're now able to seek to enter the comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership worth £9 trillion of GDP. We can get deep access to that part of the world. We're also able to strike a trade deal with the United States and with countries in the Americas as well. And that puts us in a quite unique position of having overlapping trade agreements that enable us to act as a hub for trade. There's also huge opportunities, I think, with India. And I was over in India a month ago talking to the trade minister, talking to businesses in India. And this is a market where there have been very high barriers to the UK, whether it's the 150% tax on whiskey, lots of market access barriers, making it difficult to get our products in. And again, I think the flexibility we now have as an independent trading nation will enable us to build trade with India in a way that a country like Japan, not part of the EU, has been able to deal with. Finally, there's also an opportunity, being the 5th largest trading nation, exporting nation in the world, and the 2nd largest exporting trade nation in services, for the UK to shape the future of trade. And I think we've got a really exciting agenda, which is free and fair trade. So we do believe in liberalisation. The UK global tariff was lower than the common external tariff from the EU. When we have struck trade agreements like the one we've struck with Japan, they have gone further and faster in areas like digital and data, the creative industries, mobility of business people. But we also believe in fair trade. And there are real issues in the global trading system. The WTO has not seen a significant reform of its rules since 1995. Areas like digital and data trade need to be modernised, and services trade. We need to deal with issues of carbon leakage in the world trading system, because we could end up with a net zero target here, essentially outsourcing carbon production to other countries. We also need to make sure that we don't see British producers undermined, and that could be being undermined by non-democratic regimes using state-owned enterprises to artificially subsidise goods at a very low level, or it could mean our farmers being undermined through other countries being able to engage in practices not allowed in the UK, and essentially outsourcing our farm produce. So the principle for me is that, of course, Britain can't dictate the way the rest of the world regulates itself. Of course, we don't want extraterritorial regulation. But I think our trade policy should fundamentally protect and advance our values. So when we do sign new free trade deals, we need to make sure that they're advancing the causes we believe in, and certainly aren't allowing our farmers or our manufacturers to be undermined by unfair practices elsewhere. And I think we've got a huge opportunity this year with Dr. Ngozi now leading the World Trade Organization, a real reformer on a strong mandate, with the UK leading the G7. And for the first time in many years, leading a trade track at the G7 devoted to reforming the WTO and delivering on improved trade policy. And the WTO will be having its first ministerial conference in 3 years in December in Geneva. And I think that is a real opportunity for global Britain to lead on those areas of free and fair trade as well. So in summary, I think global Britain can deliver for the UK. It can deliver for the global trade order, but most importantly, it can also deliver for the alliance of democratic nations who want to see the trading system reformed.
Thank you, Secretary of State. I'm going to go next to give his view on global Britain in the post-Brexit world to Anand Menon, Director of UK in a Changing Europe and Professor of European Politics at King's College London. So Anand, over to you.
Thanks very much indeed, Paul. And as ever, it has been a pleasure working with Conservative Home in putting on this event. I very much share the belief of the Secretary of State in the importance of trade. And I also share her view that the UK can play a pivotal role in trying to ensure that global trade is liberalised. I am sceptical that trade with other parts of the world will compensate for the loss of trade that has happened with the European Union and will happen as a result of Brexit. But I very much hope that you are right about the prospects of signing a deal with India. My experience of watching Indian trade policy is it has tended to be better in terms of rhetoric than in terms of action, and that when push comes to shove, the successive Indian governments have been quite reluctant to open up their markets. But the other thing to bear in mind is that global Britain is, of course, about far, far more than simply trade. And here I thought that the Prime Minister's speech at the Munich Security Conference last week was a a very, very good speech that laid out some really interesting lines for British foreign policy going forward. I like the emphasis on values. I like the fact that the UK has introduced Magnitsky sanctions. I like the fact that we have, as part of our reaction to Chinese actions over Hong Kong, offered a route to citizenship for about 3 million Hong Kongers. And I like the idea of this D10 grouping of democratic states, which I imagine is partly intended as part of the strategy of dealing with China. But it'll be interesting to see what becomes of that as we head towards the G7 summit in Cornwall in June. There are still, of course, big practical choices to be made. I'm not convinced as yet that the government has laid out exactly what the balance should be between engagement with China and taking arm's length posture with China with regard to its human rights record. And I think there are hard choices and honest conversations we need to have about that. I don't think China is a country we can simply try to push to one side. It's a country we're going to have to keep dealing with, and we need to think about that balance. And I think the other very profound question we face heading forward is who our key partners should be in our quest to defend the liberal international order. It was clear from the Prime Minister's speech that the United States is obviously the key partner in this. What I would just sound a slight warning tone about this, but the experience of the last 4 years indicates to me at least that whilst the United States under the right administration is a partner in building the liberal international order, the polarization of US politics means that you can't guarantee that this will be the case for the foreseeable future. And so too great a dependence on the United States at the moment might be taking some sorts of risks. And of course, the other question is, to what extent do we work with European partners in pursuing our international agenda? I think dealing with the French and the Germans as individual states rather than as part of the European Union will work up to a point. I think there's lots we can do in terms of our relations with Russia. I think there's equally lots we can do and have been doing in terms of dealing with the threat posed by Iran. But when it comes to other aspects of foreign policy, and I'm thinking particularly here of the COP26 summit, which we're hosting here jointly with Italy, we chair it in November of this year, whether or not we can really get round the fact of a need to collaborate with the EU as the EU when it comes to matters that fall within its competence, without losing that agility that we illustrated quite nicely when we reacted far before European states in dealing with Belarus last year. In conclusion, what I'd say is that this is a very, very big year for British foreign policy. It's a year like no other. We have the chair of the Security Council, the chair of the G7, and the chair of the COP26, which provides us with all sorts of potential to put some flesh on the bones of global Britain. And I would say that the early signs for me are pretty encouraging. And I want to wait with interest to see what more in the way of detail the government comes up with to put some flesh on those bones and to push that global Britain agenda forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Anand. And next up, please, we have my old friend Katy Balls, Deputy Political Editor of The Spectator. Welcome, Katy.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks for having me today. I'm going to talk a little bit, I suppose, more broadly about what global Britain means to begin. So I think that ultimately, perhaps the pro of the phrase global Britain, but also the con, is that it can mean anything to a whole range of people. And I think that it can make it quite hard to define, particularly when you're trying to work out the success or judge its success in the coming years. The challenge for the government is that ultimately what they need to spend the next 12 months doing is actually showing what it means through actions. I think that they are helped in a few ways. One being that ultimately, when we had the Brexit vote, one of the big criticisms of the Leave vote was this idea that Britain would become Little Britain, a small player. And I think that there are two things helping the UK this year in terms of showing that still an influential part of the global stage. One being the UK's presidency of the G7. That means that we ultimately have a situation where Boris Johnson is already chairing some meetings, but we also have many world leaders, including the new president, coming to sunny Cornwall in the coming months. And I think that is a clearly a very good opportunity for the government to take advantage of that and forge relationships as a new, perhaps, global Britain. Secondly, as Anand just mentioned, you have COP26, and I think that if you look at what Boris Johnson wants to do, his idea of this post-Brexit agenda that will keep the UK as an important influential country is ultimately to lead the conversation on climate change. So what could be better than the fact that we do have COP26 coming up? But then I think we obviously get into the details in terms of what from those, because those are two very big opportunities. But I think that as we talk about the various trade deals, we've already seen great success in the numbers of deals from the Secretary of State, who is with us today, but lots of these are so far rolled over. So we need to start to see what the UK gets when they are, negotiating new deals, add-ons. Some, such as the Japan deal, obviously did go further, but ultimately, for example, you have the Australia deal that is going to be a new deal. So I think that will be start to see where we can probably get more of a flavour of what the government is trying to achieve in these and what the priorities are. But I do think one, I suppose, immediate plus is, again, when you go back to the EU referendum campaign and lots of the criticisms at the time, there was a sense that as the UK would be a much smaller player, when it came to trade deals, they would have to give up lots of things, and actually it could be more a race to the bottom in terms of ethics, rather than actually prioritising, because you want to get the deal financially. And I think initially, even in the first few months of this, we've seen actually the opposite. So the fact that the UK is not having to work with lots of other countries means it's almost a clearer pursuit of its interests. So on Russia, I think the UK is able to take a tougher stance because they're not having to worry about Nord Stream in the same way that the EU is, because of all the various different ones. And we're also seeing that on China to a degree. I think that the fact also that obviously the strength of feeling within the Conservative Party on China is pushing that, but it is, I think, different than many would have predicted. And then I finally, obviously more to speak and want to get to questions, just want to talk about the Parliamentary Party and something Liz Truss touched on when she was speaking, which is, I think there has been a preconception sometimes, and Joe Johnson, I think, recently said this, that former universities minister, the Prime Minister's brother, this idea that actually global Britain is going to be an easier sell with MPs in South East England traditional seats than it is with the blue wall, formerly the red wall, because there are more protectionist tendencies. I don't completely buy that argument. I think that actually, at least if you look at the Tory MPs who come up through the ranks in the 2019 election, actually a lot of them are very pro-free trade. And also, I mean, I wrote about this a while ago, and not everyone loved the phrase, but you have the Waitrose protectionists and the Lidl free marketeers. And I think that what I mean by that is the sense that when you're talking about some of these trade deals, if anything, the protectionism from one side in terms of is lots of farming constituencies, people wanting high welfare standards. And that's not to say it's not incompatible, but then on the blue wall side, I think actually lots of MPs thinking one of the big benefits of Brexit for my voters is cheaper food on the supermarket shelf. Now, I think you can have high standards, just to be clear, and cheaper food and stuff, but I think therefore it just goes to a bit of a hint to the fact that I think it's a little bit too simplistic to say new Tory voters protectionist and old Tory voters free marketeer. I think it's more complicated, and therefore, just to end on a note to, I suppose, potential challenges ahead, I think that given Boris Johnson and many of his supporters want to lead on climate change, on environmental standards, I think it's going to be interesting to see how that is compatible and how that works alongside some of the free trade. Now, there is a way to incorporate it, but I think these are things that people will be looking to push, and does that affect some of the things in the free trade deals to make actually not quite the win that or the cheap food that some had thought. And I think that's one thing to look ahead to.
Thank you, Katy, very much. For what it's worth, I think that's a very sound tour of the parliamentary course in passing. And finally, I'm going to call on Andy Burnell, who's the CBI's International Director. So, Andy, it's over to you.
Thanks, Paul, and equally great to be here this evening. I'm also going to go a bit wider than trade in my opening kind of statement, but 2021, as we've heard, I think it's a time to look forward and outward once more. The Brexit debate has dominated and divided the UK since 2016, and kind of smoothing some of those sharp edges still remains a day-to-day issue for business. But that red heat of Brexit has passed. I think meanwhile, the global economy, as we've seen in the geopolitics, is in a huge state of flux, not for many years. We've seen COVID-19 decimate public health and economies across the world, and that fight back to that will continue long and hard in the future. We've seen burgeoning perception among people being left behind by globalization and new tech, a huge rise in protectionism in recent years. And that happened before COVID, stepping away from multilateral solutions, trade leaving entwined with kind of foreign policy aims. G20 alone, restrictions on imports in a decade up to 2019 rose from 0.7% to 10%. That's a huge amount. And equally, we've seen increasingly kind of mounting tensions between global partners that need resolving, not just the US and China. Think about kind of Facebook and Australia. And that's all been kind of around a palpable lack of global consensus building and leadership on the global stage for a long time. Now, the issues at hand in 2021 demand that is addressed. I think the UK has a really key role to play in that. The UK has a chance, and this is kind of, I suppose, the focus of today, to redefine kind of our place in the world, revitalising alliances and building consensus on the global stage. In the UK already, I think, is a global leader in many ways, but 2021 is an opportunity to kind of set that out and set our stall out for the years ahead. Think about the positives, and these are the sort of things which, if you're working in Liz's department, you'll really be hammering in home with investors. One of the world's largest economies, globally recognised for our expertise across many fields, be it financial services, education, and green standards, obviously very relevant this year. Or fintech, as we've heard a lot from the government of late. We can really play a key brokering role as the world turns to recovery, helping to bring together sides to tackle challenges that exist today, but also prepare for those tomorrow. Trade agenda is obviously one of the best known examples of that, where we can bring sides together. EU, really good example, is still our most important trading partner, still a launchpad to the world. Think about all those companies now learning about rules of origin and paperwork or the technical aspects of trade that they didn't need to know before with the EU. All that same knowledge is needed when exporting to other markets around the world. The EU will also be really important at a multilateral level and developing kind of the new rules and standards of the future. So that kind of role of bringing insights together, the EU is a really good example. Now, those new rules and standards which the UK must help shape or risk being shaped by are also really key. And I think sometimes it can feel quite distant, these kind of global rules and standards, and they affect every business and every community. It's not just about the standards and rules around exporting. It's not just around peace and security. They help protect labour, they help protect standards of labour and data. They go right through to kind of the air, our water, our oceans. They even help protect our wildlife and our kind of national heritage, things which not just the UK but every country feels are unique. And this is an entity where business as well, obviously, from the Confederation industry, must help the UK lead. The government set the rules, but it is business that operate within them to kind of prosperity, create the jobs. It is business that carry the risk if the rules are not framed or upheld correctly. And it is business who essentially trade across the world to actually utilise, support communities across the UK. But first and foremost, global Britain, I think, and this speaks a little bit to what Katy was saying, starts at home. Tony Danker, the Director General of CBI, recently set a new economic vision for the UK. How do we respond to these kind of triple economic Brexit, COVID, climate, and build a dynamic, kind of competitive, sustainable, inclusive economy? If you haven't watched it, I really encourage you to come out with more later in the year. but there are some real systemic issues that we address at home to ensure that we can compete on the global stage. It's great setting the framework and reaching out. We need to also ensure that we're building blocks within our borders. I think, going back to the start of what Liz was saying, it starts at this week's budget. I think the key thing for us is, we need to stimulate business investment. It will rely on the right regulatory and tax environment, but we should also incentivize, businesses in technology, equipment, and skills. Commit to delivering net zero for COP26 through investments in that green infrastructure and green jobs, and build, I suppose, in the positive changes. Seems like an odd thing to say, positive changes of COVID in the last year, but really getting businesses on all sides to be more digital. I'll stop there, but obviously we'll focus a bit more on trade as we go through.
Andy, thanks very much. I'm going to be as brisk with the discussion as I can, but I want to start with a question about the D10. And Anand, I'm going to start with you, as you wrote in your very interesting piece on Conservative Home this morning about it. You asked whether the Prime Minister might consider, and I'm quoting you, whether some of those he's inviting really merit the label democracy. Just explain what you meant and why it matters.
Well, as a general point, I desperately try to avoid the specifics. As a general point, I think it's important to have some metrics by which we decide if we're going to label these things as democracy. We need to be sure that we're not accused of hypocrisy. Now, my fear about the D10, which comes from a particular interest in that country, is there are some elements of developments in India at the moment that make me slightly concerned about the future of democracy in that country and whether liberal democracy is flourishing to the extent that it should be there.
Sorry, and Secretary of State, if I could turn to you with a different but related question. G7, plus the three countries to which Anand has referred to, of course, has in it Germany, France, Italy. So question at once about this project of the D10, is it really possible to do this without more substantial engagement with the European Union? Because Germany, France and Italy are all going to point to the rest of the 27. So we might not end up with a D10, we might end up with whatever it is, a D27 plus 4, I think.
I think in all of these questions, there has to be a certain amount of pragmatism about how you create the coalitions willing to deliver what we need to deliver. And we've set out our priorities, whether it's green trade, whether it's making sure that democratically underpinned free enterprise is able to compete against non-democratic countries. And we deal with things like industrial subsidies, whether it's about modernising for digital and data, and inevitably we will have different coalitions on different issues. I think that's inevitable. Of course, we're talking to the EU. I had a meeting last week with Valdis Dombrovskis, the Trade Commissioner. We're talking to the EU about how do we deal with industrial subsidies issues that are potentially undercutting our business. We talked about green trade and the issue of carbon leakage. We talked about the other issues affecting the WTO, like getting a proper dispute resolution mechanism established. And I think also Dr. Ngozi is going to be incredibly important in driving this agenda forward. We need developing countries on board to move the WTO in the right direction. And India will be, of course, a very, very important player. So I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all solution to all the issues we face globally. It's about moving in the right direction to what our values fundamentally are, protecting those values and seeking to advance them with coalitions of like-minded countries who may well change depending on what that issue is. But I think we're in a very strong position this year, being the host of COP, being the president of the G7, to drive that agenda forward. And I think certainly on the World Trade Organization, there's a huge appetite for change. People are completely fed up of how moribund the organization has become and the fact that the global trading system simply isn't functioning in the way it should. And the comment earlier about the rise in protectionism is right. And I think people are now recognizing, countries around the world are now recognizing we need to do things differently. And I think the UK can be a huge liberalising force, because yes, we may have certain thoughts about how we make trade fairer, and I've talked about industrial subsidies, I've talked about carbon leakage, but we're fundamentally a free trading nation that is less protectionist than the bloc we've just left. And I think that is a really important force that we have, and a really important case that we can make.
Katy, quickly, any further thoughts on the D10?
I mean, I think it could be a useful organisation, clearly, if it gets off the ground for the UK. I think that if you start to break down the various allies the UK has, though, I think that one big factor that has moved in the UK government's favour is the election of Joe Biden, because you suddenly have an America which I think is going to be much easier to work alongside on your various policy aims, such as ultimately I'm sure the UK government wouldn't put it like this, but, cracking down on China. And yes, Donald Trump was very, angry about China, but I think in the sense that it was hard to do collaboration, as the sense you get from all on the UK side, the Foreign Office. And because you now have Joe Biden, who wants to bring back the America of a few years ago, where it was almost, the gang leader, the ring player in this, I think that while organisations like the D10 are important, actually it's got a little bit easier for the UK government when it comes to some of this stuff, because all of a sudden you have a big ally back that does want to take on a leading role, whether that is D10 or just separately. I think that it feels a little bit more like the old order is being restored.
And Andy?
Yeah, look, obviously the G7 have invited those nations to attend. The CBI are chairing the B7, the Business 7, which has a small number of groups to the G7, and equally, we are our Indian, South Korean, and Australian businesses to attend that as well. So it's a good initiative, and particularly in Global Britain, as we're trying to build partnerships around the world, particularly on the trade agenda. From a business point of view, I think we can work together to really actually work around some of the protectionist issues in the world and support our supply chain, support resilience, and identify and lead in areas where governments not be able to. I think on that point around China, I think for me it's we as the UK we cannot afford to self-isolate from China. Full stop. We just can't afford to. The US is no other country in the world is. And we really therefore need to think about a principles-based solution, which balances the need for kind of commerce as well as the needs of citizens, and find a middle ground that's pragmatic.
Okay, from a security question really to a trade question. Secretary of State, tell us about the government's aims for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, what you want to achieve, what you think the timetable is, and what it will look like if we get there.
Well, first of all, one of the countries we didn't mention in the previous question is Japan, and I think Japan are playing an increasingly vocal role in the global trading system and are very much aligned to the UK's way of looking at things. And also they're of course they're the largest player in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and an important collection of allies is in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, including the likes of Australia and New Zealand, who are also negotiating bilateral deals with, Canada, as well as a number of South American countries. So the CPTPP is important from a geostrategic point of view because it represents the high standards, rules-based trade that the UK wants to be part of. But it's also important from an economic point of view because it's worth £9 trillion of GDP. It's 95% tariff-free. It has common rules of origin across the CPTPP, but it doesn't have the drawbacks of membership of the European Union, namely it doesn't cede control over laws, borders or money. So it is a genuine free trade club that helps the UK play a role in setting the global rules, whilst at the same time bringing huge economic benefits to our business. And Andy talked about the resilience of supply chains. it also helps in terms of the supply chains through common rules of origin as well. So it's of course about export opportunities, lower tariffs on key products like cars and whiskey, much better rules in areas like data and digital and financial services. And of course, the UK is the second largest services exporter in the world. But it's also very good for creating resilient supply chains with reliable partners who play by the rules. And just in terms of the development of CPTPP, the UK would be the first new country to join since 2018 when it was established. Of course, the CPTPP has been designed for new members to join, provided they can reach the standards. And I certainly think it's an organisation that could grow. So the UK would be in a very strong position, being on the inside of an organisation like that. In terms of timescales, we've sent our letter of intent in. The next phase is for Japan, who are chairing this year, to establish a working group. We're expecting that to be done by sort of May-ish, spring, if you like, in government terms. We then expect the negotiations to commence on the core aspects of the deal. Then we have separate market access negotiations with all of the 11 members of CPTPP, which we're conducting in many cases in parallel with the negotiations we're already doing. So we're looking at how we schedule Canada. We've already agreed to have an upgraded agreement with them. Likewise, Mexico. And in terms of the timescale, I'm not promising that it will be completed by the end of this year. That might be a bit too forward-leaning, but I don't expect a significantly lengthy negotiation because the rules of this deal are already fixed. What the UK will be doing is negotiating market access, obviously protecting our red lines, like making sure the NHS isn't affected and the price the NHS pays for drugs are not affected, or our food standards. But fundamentally, the deal is already there, and it's a high standards agreement that the UK thinks is very high quality.
Andy, do you agree with the Secretary of State that you're not expecting a, quote, significantly lengthy negotiation? And how much do you really think the UK is going to get out of this if it happens?
The Secretary of State is much better a place to judge how long it's going to take. Inevitably, it's going to take a while. I think, as there's two sides to this. One is the bilateral deals, and we're doing really well. I think Japan's over the line. Canada, Mexico, we've got a really good frame build. Australia, New Zealand underway. So I think that side of things is kind of well placed. The signing up to the package of kind of rules and standards around CPTPP is the other side of the bag. And I suppose the question is, to what degree do we sign kind of side letters to have exceptions to some of those rules and standards is the kind of the key question. So how long's a piece of string, but hopefully it can be done at a quicker pace than others would be able to do it. In terms of benefits, there's two sides to this. So one, it's existing market entrants who can use other kind of means and other kind of rules, such as the kind of the ASEAN bloc rules, to trade within the region itself. For those players, I don't think necessarily there will be as much gain as there is potentially for new market entrants who are and the sectors that can kind of benefit, such as services. I think there is a third area around CPTPP, which is with an ineffective WTO. What these kind of broad agreements do actually is help police the world trading system. So it actually helps us kind of maintain a stable trading environment for businesses to operate in. And it provides a system to actually counter abuses if they occur. So that is actually a really important aspect of CPTPP and the kind of broader, kind of larger agreements.
Okay, I'm going to go straight to the next question because we are so short of time, and I will just start with Katy. It's a question from Bridget Fowler of the Hansard Society, who asks, how do you see cooperation and coordination and the division of labour working between DIT and Lord Frost's team in the Cabinet Office? Just to start there with Katy, with Lord Frost's first day as a member of the cabinet, I believe.
Yes, first day as a member of the cabinet, and we know in advance, perhaps not the smoothest ascent, in the sense that lots of people now are very keen to say how happy they are. I think you should call it a promotion, David Frost becoming a member of the cabinet, but I think it clearly has implications in terms of what the other departments are doing. I'd be interested to hear what Liz has to say in terms of what it means for the Department for International Trade. From probably my perspective, or recent soundings, I get more of a sense, for example, that when you look at what, for example, Michael Gove was doing, the David Frost appointment, it directly affects that. And also, I think that we were seeing a conversation going on about where exactly which department should hold the power when it comes to looking after the relationship with the EU. Now, I think that Liz, I'm sure, can tell us herself in a second, it's rather busy trying to get all these trade deals with different countries. And ultimately, I think that there was a push from the Foreign Office as to perhaps it would fall there. Michael Gove. So I think there was potential for a bit of a bun fight as to where these duties went. But I think ultimately Lord Frost's appointment has ramifications in terms of the tone when it comes to things like the Northern Ireland Protocol. It also has ramifications in terms of the tone of the EU. I think the general sense is it will be more robust, but I have not got the sense that it is a huge blow to the Department of International Trade in the sense of taking on that role. And actually there is a potential for quite a lot of positive liaising.
Anand, you're a European specialist, and you know that European policy, it's been the Foreign Office's pride and joy all the way through from the age of Michael Palliser to Kim Darroch. What's it mean that this policy is no longer in the hands of the Foreign Office, but is in the hands of the Cabinet Office, where Lord Frost sits alongside Michael Gove?
Well, remember that in the past we had Aegis in the Cabinet Office that coordinated this policy, and I'm going to leave it to the Secretary of State to talk through the details of this. But what I would say is, through a lot of this conversation that we've been having, one thing is clear, is we need to ensure good coordination between what we're doing internationally and what we're doing domestically. Whether it's COP26, whether it's ambitions to use international trade as a means of levelling up, we have to make sure that that connection between what the Foreign Office or the Department of International Trade is doing abroad and what our domestic agenda is very, very tightly enmeshed. And that's something historically we've not always been particularly good at doing. That's to say foreign policy is usually over there and domestic is separate. But I think at the moment, given the issues on the international agenda, it is imperative, however the details of David Frost's job turn out to be, that we manage to coordinate between our inward-looking and outward-looking objectives.
Secretary of State, the second half of Bridget Fowler's question was, how do you plan to mitigate any difficulties that might be caused for DIT by the fact it's not responsible for the UK's largest single trade relationship with the EU?
Well, first of all, I want to agree with Anand about his point about domestic delivery. I think that's incredibly important. And I think whilst we're a member of the EU, there probably wasn't enough push on exports and pushing the domestic benefits of internationalization, and we've got a real opportunity to do that. So I find myself as a department which deals with lots of other departments, particularly BEIS, the Foreign Office, and of course Lord Frost in his previous role, and now Lord Frost in his new role. And what's essentially happened is the work that was being conducted by the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster in the Cabinet Office has now been amalgamated with the work David Frost was doing on the direct negotiations. So if you like, that EU relationship is being handled end to end. As I pointed out earlier, the Department of International Trade has responsibility for the multilateral negotiations. So where we're working with the EU on common positions at the World Trade Organization, that's a relationship I have with Valdis Dombrovskis, but actually it's a different European commissioner that is working on the trade deal, which is not the trade commissioner. So in terms of the working arrangement, that is quite effective in terms of working with different members of the European Commission. And I think it's a recognition that now we've left the EU and we have an independent trade policy, there's more trade work to be done. I'm certainly not short of things to do every day. And I know Lord Frost is, and all the foreign secretary. And, if we are to realise our opportunities an independent trading nation, if we are to project ourselves on the global stage and promote British values, we do need a significant amount of firepower and cabinet minister time to do that. And of course, I will work very closely with Lord Frost to make sure we're coordinated. We did that successfully last year when we were responsible for negotiating the rollover deals plus the New Japan deal, and Lord Frost was responsible for negotiating the EU deal. So I expect that will continue.
Andy, quickly, any thoughts on the EU and Lord Frost?
Lord Frost is an internal point, as long as it doesn't change our ability to finalise the outstanding parts of the Brexit discussions. There are still significant outstanding parts. And yes, we are going through a period of adjustment, and inevitably there are teething problems. Brexit has added cost and has added complication for industry. So as long as his appointment smooths our journey to finalising those final aspects, that's kind of key. In terms of broader EU engagement, they are going to be a key partner going forward. We sometimes lose the EU and the rest of the world trade discussions. We still trade significantly with the EU, and we will carry on doing so. And I know that DIT and the teams across the world are kind of focused on supporting business to do that, and our members work closely with them. But I think just for that, and also for kind of wide discussions at a WTO and multilateral level, that partnership is still going to be really, really key. And whether it sits with Lord Frost or whether it sits with DIT or anybody else, it's about the operational impact that's important.
Okay, a question from Irvin Okubo, and we'll start with the Secretary of State. Will Britain actively target business opportunities in sub-Saharan Africa, especially the Commonwealth countries, given that these countries possess vast natural resources? If so, will such relationships be forged on standard commercial terms and not simply aid-related programs? Secretary of State.
So we've already signed continuity deals with countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and we will continue to trade and work on the broader African relationship. I think there's an interesting development in terms of the African free trade area and how the UK works with that. We are more broadly looking at our overall preferences for developing countries, because now we're not a member of the EU. We've got an opportunity to do things differently, remove some of the cliff edges where countries became higher income. They were losing out on trade opportunities because there was a sudden ratchet up of tariff levels. Areas such as products that the UK doesn't produce, but the EU does produce, and were more restrictive in the preferences on that. So we'll be bringing out a consultation on the preference scheme later this year. But overall, I agree with the questioner. This is about a commercial trading relationship, and that is what those countries want to see.
And Anand, what's your take on all this? And just as a rider, do you think the government coming off the 0.7% is going to have any impact on global Britain?
Will have an impact on global Britain. What that impact is, I think, there's no getting away from the fact that in some parts of the developing world has been seen with, a degree of upset that we've done what we've done. That being said, the proof of the pudding is going to be in the eating. We'll have to wait and see how well the FCDO can achieve its remit of coordinating foreign policy and aid without losing sight of the aid objectives that DFID traditionally had. And that, it's not beyond the wit of man to do that. It's a complicated business merging the two departments, but I wouldn't as yet say it's definitely bound to be a failure. I think we'll just have to wait and see. The jury's out. But I just want to re-emphasize the point that the Secretary of State made, that I think aid and trade should go hand in hand. It shouldn't be an either or. Ultimately, we want to develop good trading relationships with countries that can stand on their own feet and trade with us. And that should be the objective. And we should use the two levers of our foreign policy there together in a complementary manner.
Andy, aid and trade.
Yeah, I'm not the only one because I completely agree. That's how you can separate it. In the modern world in which we live, foreign policy isn't just diplomacy. It's not just about moving big grey lumps of military around the world. Trade, foreign aid are all aspects of foreign policy, building relationships, building partnerships, making our own country a success, making it prosperous, influential and stable and secure. So, I really think we need to have a much closer relationship between the two. And that doesn't mean that we're opening up for loads of abuses and businesses gallivanting around Africa, in untold ways. In fact, because of some of the high kind of principles and the high standards that UK business operate in, it can really help developing countries in actually building kind of prosperous economies. Actually, some of the untoward nature of Chinese investment, it can help to counter some of that in these countries and build long-term partnerships which can benefit all. So no, I'm, as you can tell, very supportive.
Katy, any thoughts on the 0.7, particularly the parliamentary aspect?
Yes, well, I think it's worth pointing out that we're still being threatened of rebellion on that, and it is ultimately a measure that I think has been very unpopular, certainly with former prime ministers. You had a lot coming out at the time to say they opposed it, but how does it sit with Tory voters? I think one of the things that's been put forward is this idea that the Chancellor did it because it's fairly low-hanging fruit, in the sense it doesn't isolate the base. But I wonder if there's something else going on, in the sense that we had an increase to the defence budget, and we had the freezing, the reduction, at least temporarily, of international aid. I think that from the government perspective, it's almost as if we're going to talk about what Global Britain is, what are we focusing on in terms of that? And I think the strong hint came with the big increase in defence at the same time as the look at foreign aid, and therefore looking ahead to this integrated review, which has been a long time in the work. I think that's going to be really key to actually setting out how exactly to do it. Another thing is obviously vaccine diplomacy. That's something where you can see the UK playing a role, but at the moment you have countries, I think like China and Russia, who are taking part in their own vaccine diplomacy. But I think all these things actually should be, as has been touched on by several panel members, working together for the same aim. And I think that although there has been a lot of controversy over the international aid cut, there is the scope to have that effect through different means, and that's why I think the integrated review is going to be key.
Okay, Secretary of State, question through the Q&A from Keith Senior. Can you please comment on the news from the USA this week that they're to review the current trade deal negotiations, which presumably, he says, means talks will stall?
Well, I'm yet to speak to the new USTR, Catherine Tai. We're expecting the confirmation to take place this week, and I'm withholding judgment until I speak to her about what we need to move forward, both on the free trade negotiation, but also on the Airbus, Boeing, and getting the whiskey tariffs removed issue as well. I mean, my view of the US deal is there's a good deal to be done. We've made huge amounts of progress. We've agreed the majority of text in the majority of chapters. Now, I need to speak to the USTR about what the appropriate timeline is for us to negotiate that deal on. And of course, that is something that needs to be agreed with both parties. But I think it would be a fantastic sign as we seek to roll back protectionism, as we seek to grow the economy after COVID, for our two nations to continue with those trade negotiations and reach a conclusion.
Andy, any thoughts on the government and the new American administration and trade?
That's a much broader ask then. On the question of the FTAs, obviously we hope that we do carry on discussions, but I think we should make it clear that it's not just about free trade agreements. There's so much more work you can do on a bilateral level on market access. So you take mutual recognition and professional qualifications. In the US, that is set at a state level. And actually, is an FTA the right platform to try and unlock some of those barriers for business? Probably not. It can be done bilaterally with discussions. And CBI and my team in the US are working closely with the embassy to try and understand some of these other market access issues, so we can, regardless of what happens on the FTA, kind of progress a stronger and closer kind of bilateral trade relationship with the US.
Okay, I'm just going to gallop to my final question because I think it's an important one, and it is back to China. I mean, on the one hand, China's an enormous export market for us. I mean, according to the Commons brief in 2019, it was our 6th largest export market. But in the Commons, the government's really had to back off directly having a vote on China and genocide, with Conservative backbenchers pretty much threatening to overturn the government's policy. And so you have the security policy pulling one way with the Uyghurs and with whatever China's up to in Hong Kong, and you have a trade interest pushing the other. Is this really stable, and what's going to happen next? Just before I come to the Secretary of State, Anand.
It's not stable at the moment. I mean, the government is going to have to do a lot of work talking to its own backbenchers and figuring out what balance to strike. I think Andy's absolutely right. We can't just ignore China. China's too big, it's too important a partner, and it's going to become an even more important economic partner going forward. But this, as you said, Paul, at the moment is intensely political rather than anything else. I mean, the government needs to find out what it can do in the way of striking a balance between, on the one hand, sanctioning or taking a stand on China for its human rights abuses, and I applaud it for taking that stand, but on the other hand, persuading backbenchers that this nevertheless means that we need to have a business-like relationship with China, because the reality of international politics is China is simply too important for us not to have that kind of relationship with it.
Secretary of State, you've had to deal with this directly simply because the anti-genocide campaign has tacked their amendment onto the trade bill, where arguably it doesn't belong at all.
It is fundamentally a foreign policy issue. The issue, though, is the way that the amendment has been framed does muddy the constitutional waters in terms of what's a political decision, what's a court decision. So, of course, we abhor what has been going on in Xinjiang. We've taken strong action against it. The issue is the role of Parliament versus the role of the court. So we put forward an amendment which is about giving Parliament greater powers to scrutinise and look at the issue of genocide rather than handing the role to the UK courts. But more generally on China, of course we've got to trade with China. Of course, a lot of our allies, whether it's the United States, the EU, Japan, all trade with China. And there are plenty of areas that are not strategic, where we need to increase our trade with China and vice versa. However, we have made the move on our 5G network to avoid high-risk vendors, and we do need to make sure that we're challenging China's behavior at the World Trade Organization. I talked earlier about industrial subsidies. There's also the issue of forced technology transfer. There's also the issue of IP violations. And those are issues where Britain should not be acting alone. We should be working with allies, including the EU, including the United States, including the CPTPP nations, to shape the global rules. So we are clear-eyed about China. But of course, we have to trade with China, and we have to work with our allies to help ensure that China is abiding by the global trade rules.
Katy, am I onto something in thinking that the security and trade arms of the government are kind of heading for a smash, or is this situation more easily reconcilable than I think it is?
I think you're always onto something, Paul. And in this case, I do think there is a problem coming up the track, and also just a problem in how you handle the Parliamentary Party on this, because scepticism of China has become a mainstream opinion in the Tory party now. It's not just the China hawks, it's not just David Davis. You speak to, figures such as Laura Trott, one of the new intake, people who used to work for George Osborne, who was for the golden era of relations, now have a much more sceptical view when it comes to working with China. Now, they're not all as the same level of committed on this, but I think that one of the challenges the government is going to have here is that when you speak to some of the figures who are most active in these groups, they think their biggest problem in terms of pushing their agenda is Boris Johnson, ultimately because they think Boris Johnson is more pro-China than the bulk of the Tory party. And you can see that in his previous comments. You had reports over the weekend that Boris Johnson's father is pushing for work with China when it comes to climate. And therefore, I think actually working to almost dilute that as a movement, or to bring a bit more pragmatism in, is a harder task than whipping it up, and I think that is going to be a challenge for the government in the coming months.
Andy, just quickly, because we're out of time, do you want to add a coda to what you said before?
No, I think pragmatism is the key here. Businesses are aware of the issues in China. We'll also leave national security to government. But I think being clear-eyed, making sure businesses have the knowledge, and increasing the knowledge amongst our parliamentarians of China, the risks and the opportunities, I think is key.
Right. Apologies to everyone whose questions I couldn't get through. If we took all the questions we had, our guests and I would be here till 3 or 4 or 5 in the morning. And alas, we can't do that. But I'd like to thank you all. This has been a very wide-ranging and interesting discussion. I hope at some point Con, Home and UK and Changing Europe can do it all again. So Secretary of State, Anand, Katy and Andy, thank you all very much. And I'm extremely grateful to you all.
Thank you.